Andrew Fisher. Andy, you go Andy or Andrew?
You can call me Andy. We're friends.
Yeah. Andrew is the Margaret L. Hamilton Associate Professor of History at the College of William and Mary. His research and teaching interests focus on modern Native American history, environmental history, and the American West. His first book, Shadow Tribe, The Making of the Columbia River Indian Identity, by the University of Washington Press in 2010, examines off-reservation communities and processes of tribal ethnogenesis in the Columbia Basin. His current project is a biography of the Yakima actor, technical advisor, and activist, Nepo Stronghart. He currently directs the Environmental Science and Policy Program. And he just told me that he's not going to put anybody to sleep because you knowing that you just had a big meal.
I didn't make any promises, actually.
Without further ado, and Dr. Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Four Arrows, for that introduction. Thank you, Darcia. And Brian, who, true to form, is skipping out on my talk after recruiting me to come and give it. And thank you to the Pokagon Band of Potawatomis for hosting us here in their homeland. I'm not Yakima, but if I was, I'd say Nixmaitsky. Hello. I will be talking quite a bit about the Yakima Nation, which is the tribe I've worked most closely with since I started graduate school now more than 20 years ago. Every April, the residents of Celilo Village hold a salmon feast to welcome the returning runs of spring Chinook and thank them for their imminent sacrifice. The annual event draws hundreds of visitors to the tiny Indian community in the Columbia River Gorge, 9 miles upstream from the Dalles, Oregon, and the dam that flooded the Celilo Falls fishery in 1957. Although the river has been silenced and the salmon have dwindled, people still gather in the village longhouse to participate in ceremonies that honor the 5 sacred foods of the Washit religion: water, or chush, salmon, nusuks, deer, winat, roots, xnit, and berries, tmanit. The songs and prayers that precede the feast remind worshipers of their responsibility to respect and care for the gifts of the Creator. The longhouse leader speaks in the ancient language's manner, observes Elizabeth Woody, Oregon's current poet laureate. I just met Wisconsin's poet laureate, and a member of the Warm Springs Confederated Tribes. He speaks to all in Ichiskin. He says, "We are following our ancestors. We respect the same Creator and the same religion, each in turn of their generation, and conduct the same services and dances to honor our relatives, the roots and the salmon. The Creator at the beginning of time gave us instructions and wisdom to live the best life. The Creator made man and woman with independent minds. We must choose to live by the law, as all the others, salmon, trees, water, all live by it. We must use all the power of our minds and hearts to bring the salmon back. Our earth needs our commitment. That is our teachings. We are each powerful and necessary." Journalists and the general public are invited to witness these ritual enactments of environmental stewardship, but the feast's educational function remains secondary. First and foremost, the ceremony affirms the spiritual beliefs that still inform mid-Columbia Indian efforts to protect and restore the natural resources that traditionally sustained their culture, even as the tribes have harnessed modern technologies and scientific expertise to that end. Washit expresses what anthropologist Stephen Langdon calls a logic of relational sustainability, whereby correct action, attitude, and ritual practice perpetuate beneficial relationships between humans and the non-human beings they depend on for survival. This concept is nothing new to Indigenous peoples or even to academics, but it speaks directly to the goals of this conference, specifically to demonstrate how Indigenous cultures foster wisdom, morality, and flourishing. My purpose in this talk is to take faith seriously as both an intellectual foundation and a rhetorical strategy that mid-Columbia Indians have employed in defense of their reserved rights to harvest particular resources, as well as in their efforts to manage or co-manage those resources cooperatively, or not so cooperatively, often is the case, with state and federal agencies. At the same time, I'll explore some of the tensions within tribal communities between those who've readily enlisted Western science as an ally and those who regard technocratic solutions and tribal regulations as threats to their culture and religion. Similarly, I'll explore some of the tensions between Native people and environmentalists over specific issues of policy when it comes to salmon. Native people have variously defended, modified, and departed from their spiritual beliefs, the spiritual beliefs of their ancestors. To avoid romanticizing or essentializing them, it is important to place the spiritual, economic, and environmental practices of mid-Columbia Indians in a historical context. Washit has acquired many names during its long history. Most adherents prefer this Hopton or Ichiskeen label, meaning dance. But it is also known as the Seven Drums religion, the Sacred Dance religion, the Longhouse religion, or simply the Indian religion. This final name reflects the contemporary view that Washit is the most traditional of the various faiths practiced in mid-Columbia Indian communities, even though it has absorbed Christian influences. Some practitioners avoid the term religion altogether because of its narrow, compartmentalized connotation. Louis Malater had this to say about it. To non-Indians, the Longhouse represents religion. To Yakimas, we prefer not to use the word religion, but more a way of life, a life that was dictated to us by the natural surroundings of our environment. Most important, Washit is about honoring the foods that supplied the subsistence needs and shaped the culture of mid-Columbia Indians for some 10,000 years before the arrival of Europeans. Our food is part of our religion and is medicine to our body, explained Elsie David, another Yakima, during a 2007 interview. Everything to my people is interrelated. Our religion, Mother Earth, the animals, the trees, the rocks, they all work together. Foodways and religion are also deeply intertwined with notions of Indianness in contemporary plateau communities. That's what identifies us, says David. I don't think I would know a great deal of my culture if I just lived on cow and non-traditional food. My grandma used to say, you're not going to know anything about our people if you don't eat our food. If you're going to eat cows, you're going to be dumb like a cow. I love that quote. For the sake of brevity, my remarks will focus on salmon, the most economically valuable, ecologically vulnerable, and politically contested of the 5 sacred foods. Salmon ranks second only to water, or chush, in Washit's ritual hierarchy. And every first foods ceremony starts with you taking a sip of water and ends with you taking a sip of water, because that's the source of all life, so I'll just do that. Although the antiquity of specific practices is uncertain, anthropologists suggest that first food feasts are probably the oldest ceremonials within the Longhouse religion. These rites, conducted to welcome the arrival of different foods during the spring and summer, express the common indigenous belief that all things in nature possess spirit and power. Ritual forms and content have changed over time, starting before the arrival of Europeans and continuing to the present. By the mid-19th century, Plateau Indians had begun holding first food feasts in enlarged mat lodges or dance houses, erected specifically for that purpose. Today, the roughly 15 permanent longhouses located across the Columbia Plateau also serve as meeting halls and community centers. The ceremonies held there constitute a complex mixture of old and new elements in a distinctive nativistic framework in which the tribal language, behavioral norms, morality, relations, beliefs, and customs are perpetuated. The behavioral norms, beliefs, and customs at issue here are those relating to native interactions with the natural world. The first Euro-Americans to observe plateau religious rituals noted the importance placed on respectful treatment of food sources, especially the anadromous fish runs that supplied most of the Indians' protein. Traveling up the Columbia River in April of 1806, members of the Lewis and Clark expedition witnessed a first salmon feast in the village of Wishram, just above the Dalles. My friend Carol Craig, when she talks about Lewis and Clark and their guide Sacagawea, say that she was the first, they were the first men to ask a woman for directions. So she was supposedly guiding them down the Columbia River. In the Dalles, or near the Dalles, they noticed one of these ceremonies in progress and wrote, "There was great joy with the natives last night in consequence of the arrival of the salmon. one of those fish was caught. This was the harbinger of good news to them. They informed us that these fish would arrive in great quantities in the course of about 5 days, which is a ritually significant number in the Washit religion. This fish was dressed and being divided into small pieces was given to each child in the village. This custom is founded in superstitious, as they saw it, opinion that it will hasten the arrival of the salmon. No one in the village could catch or consume any of their own fish until this ceremony had been performed, and that is still the way it is today. Fur traders at this time found that native people would not sell any salmon until these ceremonies had been held. Even so, scholars still debate whether the first salmon ceremony encouraged or affected deliberate resource conservation among Plateau Indians before it became necessary in the 20th century. Shepard Kretsch, who wrote a book called The Ecological Indian, suggests that reduced harvests were merely an incidental result of Northwest Indian religious ceremonies. True conservation, he said, is by design, and practices are conservationist not because they have sustainable consequences, but if they meet intentionally formulated ends. By contrast, scholars like Eugene Hun and Joseph Taylor have argued that first food feasts and associated beliefs serve a pragmatic ecological purpose. By postponing the start of the regular spring harvest and prohibiting fishing under certain circumstances, ritual prescriptions allowed the upriver escapement of many salmon that might otherwise have fallen prey to native nets. So, for example, prescriptions against fishing at night, prescriptions against fishing on Sundays, or after a drowning death, which were not uncommon in the turbulent waters of the Columbia. These were all ways in which native people allowed fish to go upriver without having to run a gauntlet of nets. More broadly, oral traditions about the consequences of wasteful hunting and hoarding taught that animal spirits would punish disrespectful behavior with bad luck or illness, or even the withdrawal of the animals themselves from human access. Charles Sams, a Cayuse member of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Reservation, recalls hearing such stories during his childhood in the 1970s. In one coyote tale, Spritiuality, tells all the animals that they must give their gifts to the new people that the Creator is bringing into the world. Salmon replied, "Of course I will. I want to provide 2 gifts. One is my body, so that the humans will have that food, will make them strong and healthy. I will also give the humans my voice completely, so that they can talk with one another." Coyote is very impressed with these gifts. Salmon calls out one last time. "With these gifts comes a big responsibility, though. I ask that the humans speak for me and for all the other animals and plants of the earth. The humans must promise to protect us now and for future generations." By such means, argues Taylor, Indian culture and economy produced a sustainable tension between society and nature. Insisting on a scientific basis for conservation, I think, misses the point that mid-Columbia Indians were doing what they believed was necessary to perpetuate the resource. Although salmon runs fluctuated in accordance with natural conditions, native peoples had very little reason to doubt the efficacy of their methods until the crisis that followed Euro-American colonization. Mid-Columbia Indians secured their right to fish through treaties signed with the U.S. government in 1855. Under growing pressure from American colonists, native leaders ceded millions of acres in what are now the states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, but specifically retained certain lands or reservations and the perpetual right to fish, hunt, and gather in all usual and accustomed places both on and off the reservations. The treaties also called into being new tribal confederations, the Yakima Nation, the Nez Perce tribe, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, and the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, whose members and interests increasingly clashed with non-Indians, the non-Indian majority in the Pacific Northwest. By the 1870s, salmon had become a lucrative commodity that could be canned and shipped around the world for sale in the capitalist marketplace. Although some Indians also sold fish to the canneries, they resented the usurpation of their traditional fishing grounds and the accelerating destruction of salmon habitat by non-Indian ranching, logging, irrigation, and dam construction. By the early 20th century, many salmon stocks were already in steep decline. the states of Oregon and Washington responded with conservation laws that generally favored non-Indian commercial and sports fishers over Indians, who found their off-reservation fishing increasingly constrained by a web of regulations governing illegal gear, trespassing, licensing, closed seasons, prohibited areas, catch limits, and the sale of fish. When Indians caught salmon and steelhead trout in violation of these laws, state authorities arrested and prosecuted them for poaching. Treaties, the states contended, gave Indians only the same privileges as white citizens of the territory. Tribal leaders and defendants responded to this challenge with arguments rooted in their own interpretations of the treaties and their own understanding of the salmon. Chief George Meninik, a witness to the Walla Walla Council proceedings and the son of a Yakima treaty signer, expressed a common critique of state jurisdiction in his testimony during the Tuesnut case, one of the first Indian trials under Washington's stringent 1915 Fisheries Code. He said, and the quote you see is part of this, "God created the Indian country, and it was like he spread out a big blanket. He put the Indians on it. They were created here in this country, truly and honestly, and that was the time this river started to run. Then God created fish in the river and put deer in the mountains and made law through which has come the increase of fish and game. Then the Creator gave us Indians life. We awakened, and as soon as we saw the game and fish, we knew that they were made for us. We had the fish before the missionaries came, before the white man came. We were put here by the Creator, and these were our rights as far as my memory to my great-grandfather. This was the food on which we lived. My strength is from the fish. My blood is from the fish, from the roots and berries. The fish and the game are the essence of my life. I was not brought from a foreign country and did not come here. I was put here by the Creator. We had no cattle, no hogs, no grain, only berries and roots and game and fish. We never thought we would be troubled about these things. And I tell my people, and I believe it, it is not wrong for us to get this food." Tuesnut was merely the opening salvo in a 70-year-long battle, actually still going on, to control tribal fishing rights. Countless trials like it forced native understandings of nature into conversation with the dominant discourses of science and law in the United States. Prosecuted again and again for violating state conservation laws, mid-Columbia Indians began to frame their defense of treaty rights in terms the courts could recognize and respect. The word conservation also started to appear in both public and private pronouncements concerning tribal fishing rights and religion, as Native people explicitly identified their traditional beliefs and practices with the avowed goals of state regulation. After a Washat service in the 1960s, for example, Longhouse leader Robert Jim told his sons, "This is what we believe. This is what is important: cooperation, sharing, hospitality, reciprocity, and conservation. Never take more than you need." Yakima Tribal Councilman Johnson Meninik echoed this sentiment in 1974 when he assured state officials that indigenous customs could effectively guide tribal regulation of the fishery. "I believe we've practiced lifelong conservation. We're born to it. We're raised with it. We die with it. Our people who were our forefathers have practiced this tradition. They know what to do, and they hand it down to us, and we're going to hand it down to the younger generation." By that time, Native people had clearly learned the language of conservation, but it does not necessarily follow, as Kretsch would suggest, that they learned the concept from their colonizers. Tribal co-management of Northwest fisheries is a legal right won during the notorious fish wars of the 1960s and 70s. Tired of shouldering the burden of conservation and the blame for the sorry condition of salmon stocks, Indians on Puget Sound and the Columbia River fought back against state regulations that interfered with their treaty-reserved rights to fish at all usual and accustomed places. In 1969, a vigorous protest fishery on the Columbia produced Judge Robert Baloney's decision in So Happy versus Smith and United States versus Oregon, a joint ruling which held that the state's restrictions on Indian fishing were invalid and discriminatory. While the state could regulate off-reservation Indian fishing, its powers were limited by certain conditions and standards that Baloney spelled out in his decree. State regulations must be proven reasonable and necessary for conservation. They must be the least restrictive possible, and they must not discriminate against Indians who can fish at times and with gear prohibited to non-Indians. Furthermore, Baloney stated, the tribes must be given a fair and equitable share of the catch, although he didn't define exactly what that meant, and the opportunity for meaningful participation in the regulatory process. This standard helped shape fisheries management practices as the tribes and the states gradually moved from litigation toward cooperation. The Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission emerged from a 1976 Memorandum of Understanding between the Bonneville Power Administration, which distributes the power from Columbia River dams, and the 4 treaty tribes party to U.S. versus Oregon, which you see there, the Yakima, the Nez Perce, the Warm Springs, and the Umatilla. Under the terms of the memorandum, the BPA agreed to fund tribal participation as part of its legal obligation to mitigate the effects of federal dams. The tribes then passed resolutions authorizing the commission, and by March of 1977, they had adopted its constitution and bylaws. CRITFIC's structure reflects the determination of its founders to overcome tribal differences and practice cooperative management. The 4 tribal fish and wildlife committees comprise the commission's governing body, and they must reach consensus before it can act on their behalf. Each tribal committee appoints several commissioners who annually select 3 officers, a vice chair, a secretary, and a treasurer, and a chairperson from among their ranks, with each tribe holding the chair on a rotating basis. The position of executive director also rotates among the tribes to avoid charges of bias, although you do hear that, those kind of charges. Although disagreements arise within the commission, it remains committed to unity of action in service of the salmon. CRITFIC has expanded greatly in size and expertise since the late 1970s. At first, it employed only 2 fish biologists and depended heavily on state and federal fishery agencies for advice and support. Over the years, though, as the tribes gained confidence and experience, CRITFIC's staff grew to include additional biologists, fish passage specialists, policy analysts, attorneys, public relations officials, and law enforcement personnel. Some tribal fishers initially resented the imposition of what they saw as yet another layer of management. But most now view the enforcement program as essential to their own safety and protection, as well as to the preservation of the salmon. Commission staffers are active in gathering scientific data, setting fishery seasons and harvest quotas, carrying out habitat restoration projects, offering technical support to tribal hatcheries, carrying out habitat, I already said that, and lobbying policymakers. In 1980, Congress mandated that the Northwest Power Planning Council give weight to tribal recommendations in running regional hydropower operations. For years, BPA used its power of the purse to hamstring recovery measures, with endless complaints about cost effectiveness and scientific uncertainty. CRITFIC developed its own management objectives, though, and over time, it garnered the respect, if not always the affection, of the numerous state and federal agencies involved in salmon restoration. CRITFIC offers a natural vehicle for united action by the 4 treaty tribes. In order to operate on a consensual basis, however, the organization first had to overcome the resentment of tribal fishers, as well as their skepticism of scientific resource management. That task initially fell to Ted Strong, a Yakima with extensive knowledge of computers and finance, but little direct experience with fishing. When he became CRITFIC's director in 1989, Strong recalled, many of his own tribal members detested what they felt were unnecessary restrictions upon their right to free access to fish and fisheries. They not only blamed CRITFIC for continuing persecution of tribal fishers like David Sohappy, who spent 5 years in federal prison for illegal fishing. They also blamed it for the declining number of salmon and the continuing constriction of tribal fishing seasons. And you can see there David Happy saying in 1978, in reference to tribal regulations, no man should be required to obtain a permit from another man to practice his religion. So Strong had to overcome this, and he said, we found ways to try to understand the situation and ease some of the conflict. But the commissioners knew that they would have to go home and face their own tribal membership. And any elected official coming home and saying, look, we're only going to get 90 fish this year, have to face tribal members here who will say, That's why we should never have agreements with the state. The state doesn't do a damn thing to help us. The state isn't there when we're trying to allocate 390 fish among 17,000 tribal members. They're over there gloating over their scientific restrictions and so forth. Convincing tribal members that Western science could supplement spirituality and traditional ecological knowledge thus became one of Strong's core missions. He said, "I really and sincerely believed it was a time of reconciliation, a time of reconciling between the deeply held religious and cultural beliefs of Indian peoples and emerging and ubiquitous scientific forums that were being planned and designed, which I also felt were going to take over the Columbia Basin." During his 10-year tenure, CRITVIC's expanding technical staff worked to integrate the material and moral dimensions of salmon management. Strong admitted that he initially had a lot to learn about both. Only 10 years old when the Celilo Falls drowned in 1957, he'd grown up on the Yakima Reservation and attended Bible school instead of longhouse ceremonies. Although his childhood diet included such traditional fare as fried deer meat and fishback soup, which I have not tried, fishback bone soup, his parents farmed and raised cattle rather than trying to wring a livelihood from the depleted runs of the Columbia. College took him even farther from the river and his roots, so he came to CRITVIC with business acumen, but only limited knowledge of the various salmon stocks the tribes fished. At first, his executive style and bold plans to reorganize the commission antagonized some of its veteran employees. Over the years, though, Strong learned to speak the differing languages of biologists, fish passage specialists, policy analysts, attorneys, and police officers. He also came to appreciate and participate in the Washit religion, partially at the urging of his wife, a Navajo, and partially because it mattered so deeply to the people he represented. This spiritual understanding of the issues helped Strong, as he says, set the framework to bring science in. Science is in a larger context. You look at the earth as a kindly mother, generous, bountiful, never forsakes her children. And it is said that her children are the water and the foods. We follow behind them. You can't just bring in science because there's no explanation for the spirit of this land. And I didn't bring in science as a replacement. I didn't bring in science to supplant our stories. Strong was not alone in noting the power of faith to transform and elevate the commitment of CRITVIC staff. Douglas Dompierre, a non-Indian fish biologist, spent 26 years developing and overseeing fish passage, harvest management, habitat protection, and hatchery programs for the tribes. His recent book, Fight of the Salmon People, Blending Tribal Tradition with Modern Science to Save Sacred Fish, chronicles both the history of hatchery production in the Columbia Basin and the deepening admiration he felt for the tribal cause. As I looked at salmon management through the eyes of the salmon's first caretakers, he writes, I began to understand the depth and strength of the tribe's culture and their concern for the resource. Each chapter of the book begins with an oral tradition or story that grounds contemporary tribal actions in the indigenous beliefs and customs of mid-Columbia Indians. Like Ted Strong, though, Dompierre recognized that moral suasion alone would not put the salmon back in the rivers or sway the agricultural, industrial, and electrical power interests whose practices had pushed salmon to the brink of extinction. The tribes needed a plan, one informed by traditional values but based on sound scientific data, feasible policy goals, and clear technical recommendations. That plan became known as Waikunishmi Wakishwit, Spirit of the Salmon, or the Tribal Restoration Plan, the Indian alternative to more timid recovery measures proposed by the state and federal governments. First issued in 1995 and updated continually, the Tribal Restoration Plan provides the only basin-wide plan that encompasses the requirements of the treaties, the Endangered Species Act, and other federal and state laws protecting salmon and their habitat. Unlike competing plans, it also covers Pacific lamprey, which Native people call eels, and sturgeon, and it goes far beyond mitigation to advocate significant improvements in ecosystem health and changes in hydroelectric power production. The heart of Waikunishmi Wakishwit is the concept of gravel-to-gravel management. Salmon spawn in gravel beds and then migrate out to sea and come back to their natal streams, spawn and die. a life cycle framework that seeks to shepherd salmon from their natal streams and back again under the best possible conditions. This model, like the spiritual principles that animate it, takes a holistic and adaptive view of the natural systems and cultural modifications that affect salmon survival. Adaptive management is learning by doing, an approach the tribes have used for thousands of years, explained Yakima Tribal Chairman Jerry Meneinik in 1995. Tribal advocates believe that their plan's blend of faith and reason can restore sanity along with the salmon. And when you look at salmon being barged downstream to get around dams or put into trucks and then pumped back into the river below the dam, it does sound a bit insane. As Yakima Fish Commissioner Wendell Hannigan remarked on the debut of Waikunishmi-Waukeshiwit, our salmon plan is the only vehicle we can use to bring our spiritual and cultural values into the region's conservation efforts. The tribal restorations plan title, Waikunishmi-Waukeshiwit, and Hannigan's words certainly fit the trope of the ecological Indian. But Critfic's policy positions are not so easily categorized. Significantly, the tribes and the TRP, for short, reject the environmentalist critique of hatchery fish as Frankenstein monsters that will ultimately destroy the genetic purity and health of wild salmon. Because conservation biologists are very critical of the way hatcheries have been used historically, tribal facilities have introduced more naturalistic rearing pens featuring curved raceways, so fish have to swim around rather than up and back like an Olympic pool. Subsurface feeding, so they don't just learn that people throw food in the water and you come up and get it. They also allow predator access to the pens so that fish have to grow up in fear of being eaten by other animals. So they've introduced these kind of changes as well as acclimation procedures to improve survival rates in the wild. So as you can see in the lower left, instead of releasing fish, juvenile fish, straight into the streams from the hatchery, they put them in acclimation ponds to imprint on their natal stream, and then they let them go when they're ready. Critfic also places great stock in a technique called supplementation, which combines habitat restoration with hatchery transplants to rebuild naturally spawning runs. These methods help put salmon back in the Umatilla River, where they'd gone extinct, and they are currently being used to repopulate the upper Yakima watershed. Supplementation, together with increased spill from the dams during peak migration periods, has been widely credited for the rebound seen in runs during recent years. Mid-Columbia Indians would prefer to see hatcheries made redundant and dams removed. But in the meantime, they generally support any measure that puts more fish in the rivers. Dompierre, among others, frankly dismisses the idealistic dream of self-sustaining wild runs in a river system transformed by dams. For the same reason, Critfic has backed state proposals to shoot sea lions that gather at Bonneville Dam to feast on migrating salmon. Simultaneously evoking and defying the ecological Indian stereotype, Critfic chairperson Fidelia Andy declared in 2008, "There is no nobility in one species squatting in a fish ladder and eating another into extinction. Our Creator gave us the responsibility to protect the balance among all creatures in the ecosystem. Traditionally, we accept responsibility for the survival and prosperity of the resources that surround us." Normally, non-Indian advocates of salmon restoration would applaud tribal invocations of the Creator and a culture of stewardship for nature's bounty. In this case, however, some environmental organizations and supporters recoiled in horror at the potential slaughter of creatures beloved by much of the American public and once endangered themselves. "Sea lions are natural predators of salmon. Fishermen are unnatural," said one online commentator. "Maybe we should start shooting the fishermen," suggested another. The Humane Society of the United States sought an injunction to prevent the shootings, noting quite correctly that sea lions kill far fewer salmon than birds, human fishers, dams, and habitat destruction. They have about 4% maybe. But a federal judge upheld the sentence for repeat offenders. While the Mid-Columbia Treaty tribes have many things in common with non-tribal activists dedicated to saving salmon and restoring the rivers, the tensions between them reveal much about the class and racial biases that still bedevil mainstream environmentalism. Everyone agrees that the rivers and fish need help if salmon and salmon cultures are to survive. Northwest Native peoples continue to lead that fight. Since his release from prison for illegal fishing, Wilbur Slockish Jr. has served on the Bi-State Water Quality Commission and various tribal projects related to salmon recovery, and he's currently one of the Yakama Nation's commissioners on CRITFIC, an organization he once hated with a passion. His reasons for doing so remain firmly rooted in traditional spirituality. Like the Yakama chief Alchai, who in 1855 expressed fear that selling land would anger the creator, Slockish believes that he will be held accountable for his ecological actions in this life. When his time comes, he told an interviewer at a meeting of the Hanford Health Effects Subcommittee, he hopes to be able to tell the creator that I did my best to leave the world as he wanted it, that I did my best to make sure that my children had a place to survive, that my animal resources, that my plant life were here as he placed them, and I did my best to ensure that they were here for future generations. There's some danger in concluding with such a rhetorical flourish. The eyes of environmentalists become misty, while those of scholars begin to roll. Either reaction obscures our vision of the important part religion has played in mid-Columbia Indian efforts to protect traditional resources and treaty rights. By taking faith seriously, we come to a fuller understanding of why and how mid-Columbia Indians have fought so steadfastly to save their 5 sacred foods. Their investment in these resources and the right to harvest them is more than material and economic. It is cultural and spiritual as well. Washut still frames their logic of engagement with salmon and other foods, but they have also enlisted the tools of modern science. Recently, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation developed an entire land management plan specifically dedicated to preserving the 5 sacred foods. Eric J. Quiemps, the director of the reservation's Natural Resources Department, came up with the idea in 2006 while serving food to tribal members at the annual Root Feast. I thought, this is all about the table in front of us and the need to recognize it. Quiemps also holds a degree in wildlife science from Oregon State University, but he and his staff are perfectly comfortable speaking of their work in terms of religion. The challenges posed by resource depletion and state regulation have compelled mid-Columbia Indians to integrate the idea of conservation into their spiritual vocabulary, but the concept was neither alien to nor incompatible with the core principles of their religion. What it's saying is this is your relationship to the landscape and these foods, says Eric Quiemps, and you have to take care of them for them to be sustainable. Thank you. Oh, you can. Yeah, I can. Yes.
Thank you, Andrew. Steve Langdon from Alaska. I was sitting on a plane about a year ago by a legal guy who was working for a trust of the Canadian tribes above the border, who have joined together with the intention of reestablishing all of those destroyed stocks that the dams above that. And I assume that there is some working relationship and now across borders between the tribes to move towards that goal, the reestablishment of the salmon runs in Canada that were halted.
The ones above on the Columbia?
Yep.
Because the Fraser was never dammed.
No. It's
Right.
all, these are all Columbia, Kootenai and Okanagan tribes up in that district. Are you familiar with that effort, and has that intersected with these tribes yet?
I'm not familiar with what's going on in terms of cooperation between the lower basin tribes and upper basin tribes, most of which don't have treaty rights and who lost access to the salmon, especially after Grand Coulee Dam went in without fish ladders and wiped out more than 1,000 miles of spawning habitat up in Canada, especially. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if they are. There's already extensive cooperation between CRITFIC and the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, which represents the treaty tribes west of the Cascades in Washington that are party to U.S. versus Washington, which came after the So Happy decision. So people like Billy Frank Jr., who passed away recently, trying to get all the tribes in the Northwest, and I assume that would include Canadian nations, First Nations as well, to use their collective strength to force a change in policy. And the tribes have been very successful in using treaty rights as leverage to try and stop projects that they oppose, like coal terminals on Puget Sound and at the mouth of the Columbia, and more recently, oil trains. They're seeking injunctions to do that, to stop those projects.
Well, I think the Canadian tribes' expression and their coordination to do that is a deeper layer in terms of demonstrating those long lost fish and the necessity of having them return to their lands as well.
Yeah. Because one of the things that the border created were these artificial distinctions between Canadian First Nations and American Indian tribes, and fisheries policies have traditionally pitted American fishermen versus Canadian fishermen, and Native people, to some extent, got caught up in that. And also, different tribes party to U.S. versus Washington have fought each other over their share of a usual, whose sites are usually customed, and also their share of the take every year. And CRITFIC and the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission are in the business of trying to put an end to that sort of squabbling and work together. Yeah.
Earlier we mentioned climate change, and I was gone through periods of drought. And during the periods of drought, where does that water, goes the water? Because our agricultural components, fisheries need that water. So does the Department of Interior win that fight, or do the tribes win that fight?
That one's ongoing, and it's only going to get worse because of climate change. I not only had to follow lunch, I had to follow Dr. Doom. And so this message that the tribes have actually been, have had considerable success in bringing back salmon. The big question mark is, what happens if ocean temperatures continue to rise and ocean acidification destroys the food chain. You already see the effects of climate change in less precipitation overall, and less precipitation falling as snow, because salmon depend on the slow release of that snow melt. More precipitation falls now as rain. So you have serious questions about whether salmon redds, the spawning beds are going to be exposed, and whether they'll be washed out by torrents, that are of rainwater in the mountains that comes down and tears out the redds. So there are a lot of questions about what bigger problems like climate change mean for salmon restoration. But your question about drought, that's always been a problem. One of the historic causes of salmon decline was the drawdown of tributary streams like the Umatilla and the Yakima in the Columbia Basin for irrigation. And you had juvenile fish that were getting sucked into canals and dying, and then you had adult fish that didn't have water to swim in, when they would come back in the summer to spawn. And those are still problems, but the tribes have again used their leverage, their treaty rights to hold, but they're doing it less through litigation now and more trying to sit down with irrigators and ranchers and state and federal officials and broker compromises that gives everyone a little bit of what they want. In the spirit of cooperative management. And the Yakimas, in just the last year, actually won a victory in terms of keeping more inflow, in-stream flow in the Yakima River in particular, because they've done all this work to put fish back, but the fish still need water. They haven't perfected that yet scientifically, fish that don't need water to swim. So they're working on it, but that's the big question. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak to the, my name's Isaac Akande at the University of Illinois. I went to the University of Oregon and I worked with the tribes in that area, the Confederated tribes.
I'm also a duck.
Go Ducks. But I was wondering if you could speak to the significance, because you mentioned it, of Celilo Falls and what that meant culturally for the tribes in the Northwest, and the damming of it and the flooding that caused that historic.
Yeah, Celilo Falls. In an earlier version of the PowerPoint, I had an image of it. It was flooded by the Dalles Dam in 1957. It was the last major indigenous fishery, traditional fishery to go under. There are still dip net fisheries on tributaries like the Klickitat and the Deschutes, but I mean the main stem Columbia, all the falls that were the perfect place to catch fish are gone now. The Grand Coulee Dam flooded Kettle Falls, and every dam since has taken out fisheries and also forced the relocation of villages that had avoided removal during the reservation era. So the loss of Celilo Falls is felt very deeply by many Native people today, many of whom remember seeing it or even fishing there when they were younger. It's sort of become symbolic of the whole problem. And their hope is that someday, the dams, at least some of them, will be removed and bring back some of these places as well as the fish. There's actually sonar imagery that suggests the rock formations, at Celilo Falls are still there. And the Army Corps of Engineers has toyed with the idea of like a temporary drawdown that would expose them so people could see it. And the reaction among tribal elders was one of horror. Like, why would you do that to us? By making us see it again and then just taking it away. There's still a lot of work to do in terms of...
Are you optimistic? One word. Are you optimistic? Like what do we gotta hope? I mean, like...
After Dr. Doom's talk? No. Part of the reason I've written about this and wanted to talk about it is because I think you see tribes taking the initiative, leading the way. It's not the usual story of hapless victims being overrun and losing everything. That is cause for optimism, but it's an uphill fight, and the climate change is the big wrench in the works that could, for all the progress they've made, if the larger system is undermined, then it won't mean much in the end. So that's a nice equivocal answer for you. Am I optimistic? It depends on the day, how much sleep I've had, my mood. Sometimes.
We have to stop.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No problem.